Greetings and salutations, I'm Sky, and today I thought we'd do a comparison between the cheapest watercolor I own and the most expensive. Aha, there you go. Ta-da! Old, very old. Here's the new stuff. Nice. I'm starting off with the cheap paint. I thought it'd be the best test if I used it on Tonarl since he has a lot of darker colors. This paint is pretty old. It came from a craft kit I got, 8 years ago at least. Based on the amount of things that were included in the kit, paper and other supplies, I'm guessing that the paint was probably somewhere between $1 to $5. As far as the quality goes, I've definitely used a lot worse, especially from this price range. So, let's compare the stats. The colors go on pretty smoothly, although you can definitely tell it has a chalky feel to it. Starting off with the cons. One major issue I noticed was when I put the paint down onto the page, it pretty much absorbed immediately. With any quality watercolor, especially on good watercolor paper, you should not only be able to spread your watercolors out in a nice wash, but you should also be able to lift the pigment that you've already put on the page. This helps you to spread your colors and to scrub away mistakes. See on the neck, for instance, that there's a big splotch that I couldn't get rid of. Thankfully, you couldn't see it as much by the time I was done with my layering and my pencils. But it still bothers me that it's there. This is also a big problem because the paint does bleed. I feel like it was bleeding even when I put the paint down on a perfectly dry page. This caused problems, especially for his eyebrows. Thankfully, his eyebrows are black, so you can't see it too much, but it's still there. Something else I noticed while I was working is even though I am working in a fairly hot room, so I can't say that this is entirely the watercolor's fault, the pigment did dry very quickly, even in the palette. Since we're nitpicking anyway, with high-end watercolors, you can check online or it'll be written on the box or the tubes for the light fastness of the actual pigment. With these watercolors, I have no way of knowing. Because of this and because of the fact that this was, well, $1, I have to assume that they are indeed not light fast. Something else that probably doesn't bother anyone else, but hey, maybe I'm not alone. The color organization for these palettes, and by these palettes I mean cheap palettes, always feels so random. We've put the blue next to the brown and the brown's next to the other blue, and this is all across from the red, and arguably the placement of the yellow, orange, and red makes sense. You know, you got yellow, orange, red. But everything else is just scattered. The color selection is also very poor. In a normal limited color palette, you would have 2 reds, 2 yellows, and 2 blues. The only color here that I have 2 of is the blues, and there's only 1 dark blue. For some reason, the people who made this palette decided that it was very important for me to have a pink. As if I couldn't make pink because this is watercolor. I can't help but feel that the person who designed this palette has never used watercolor before. Alright, now that I've picked this palette to pieces, let's talk about the workarounds that I found. Since the watercolor dries so quickly and absorbs straight into the page, I decided that the only possible solution was to saturate the page with water before I put any color down. I also had to be very careful about swatching my colors before I used them, because if I put the wrong color down, there was no changing it. Also, crying when you put down the wrong color. Very helpful. Would recommend. The only advantage of the watercolor being so thick and chalky was that I could actually use the white as kind of a wash to fix my mistakes. And by fix my mistakes, I mean make his sclera a little bit less yellow. I did try to embrace the unavoidable texture in his hair a little bit. You can see that there's darker patches, and that was intentional. I had a lot of trouble shading since the watercolor was so opaque. It didn't really let me apply too many layers or I would lose the original color. I also had a hard time trying to figure out how dark the color would be when it dried, since it really lightens up quite a lot. My Winsor and Newton doesn't lighten up nearly as much when it dries. So can we just take a moment to appreciate how shallow these pans are? Like, seriously. Alright, now let's talk about the advantages of using a cheaper watercolor. For one thing, it's obviously cheap. Oftentimes $1, maybe $10 for a set. This depends on whether you get the pan watercolors or the tube watercolors. I would say if you're going to get cheap watercolor, just get the really cheap stuff though. If you want to invest in your watercolor at all, definitely get the higher quality watercolor sets, since those will serve you better long term. The nice thing about using a cheap watercolor set is there's definitely less pressure about using it. So if you've never used watercolor and you're not sure if you even like using it, this could be a nice, cheap and low pressure way to get into it. Watercolor clearly doesn't degrade that much in the pans, so if you have an old watercolor set lying around, even if it is cheap, it might be nice to give it a try. I will say that the pigment was pretty easy to mix, but if you're trying to learn color theory, this would not be the right way to do it. I'd recommend either getting a more expensive limited palette or buying individual tubes for that. As I mentioned earlier, the pan color selections for these cheap watercolor kits tend to be pretty poor. Alright, now let's talk about my Winsor and Newton watercolors, which are the expensive watercolors. The original set I got, which you can see here, was only about $25 or something. I can't find the original set now on Amazon, so I can't verify that. But I have found a lot of other comparable sets. They're the Winsor and Newton Cotman watercolors, so they're a little bit less expensive than the full price artist grade watercolors that they sell. This set lasted me for many years, and I only recently decided to get some tube paints to replenish the pans. The tubes I got were the 71 ounce. I know they also sell a smaller tube size, but I figured I wasn't going to be changing brands anytime soon, so getting the large size made sense for me. The price for each individual tube varies depending on the color. The price range for these seems to be $10 to $16 without tax. I definitely recommend getting one of their little kits as a starter instead of buying the tube straight off, because then you get these nice little pans and a nice little tray to keep them all in and all that stuff. And it's cheaper. So, let's talk about the stats of these watercolors, starting with the cons. I am arguably slightly biased towards these watercolors since these are my chosen set, but I did use the other set for many years, so I think that this is a fairly fair comparison. The cons that I've noticed for these watercolors are a fairly short list. Number one being that they are kind of expensive, but that's kind of to be expected from watercolors. As I mentioned previously, a single set can last you many years, and getting the tubes, well, you're pretty much set for life. As with any watercolor, any good watercolor, they do lift from the page somewhat, but only really when you either 1. Scrub out them really hard, or 2. Layer really thick layers of watercolor, which I wouldn't recommend anyway. Okay, that's kind of the only negative things that I can think about to say for these. So, on to the pros. First off, the colors themselves are very vibrant. You can see that the color that the watercolors are when they first get put down and the color that they are when they dry are fairly similar. I personally consider this a huge advantage since I like to know what color my watercolors are going to be before they dry. The darker the color, the lighter the watercolors will appear when they're dry. However, the difference is only negligible. Something else I appreciate about these watercolors is how easy they are to layer. Watercolors oftentimes work best in thinner layers, and you can see that I've used multiple layers for the skin, hair, clothing, everywhere really. I find that using layers is especially helpful in shading. Not only to build up a darker color, but also to tint the watercolor that you've already put down. You'll see that I use the same color that I use for his blush on the shadows once I've already laid them down. This helps the shadows to blend into the skin tone instead of making him look sickly. The texture, if you want to call it that, of the watercolors is also very smooth and not chalky like the first palette we tried. Even though the price for these watercolors might look steep, you actually get a lot in the tubes and in the palettes. The light fastness, or permanence, for these watercolors can easily be found online as well as on the tubes. Winsor and Newton in particular are known for making light fast colors. That's partially why I chose them. In fact, I've had a light fastness test up for the last year, and the colors are still the exact same as they were when I first put them up. Even though I wouldn't recommend displaying your watercolors in direct sunlight, it's nice to know that they can still survive that. While I've got your attention, please make sure you subscribe and you know the rest. So, what are my final thoughts? I'd say that cheap watercolors can be a fun and easy way to get into watercolors. However, they're definitely not suitable for any sort of permanent art. Anything you want to display, really. Professional watercolors, such as the ones I have, even if they're of student grade, are definitely better for anything you want to display, and they're also easier to work with. I found that working with the professional watercolors felt easier and more intuitive. And I was also able to include more subtleties and extra techniques with the more expensive watercolors. That being said, though, I don't think that the piece that I did with the cheap watercolors looks bad, especially after being zhuzhed up a little bit with the pencils. So, if you're not sure if you even like watercolor, getting a cheap set can be very helpful. But if you're planning to make this a long-term hobby, I'd take the plunge. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Catch you later.